Let's see here, get all this straightened out. You know the drill. Mm, mm. Howdy, y'all. Welcome to History by Phillips. I'm Mr. Phillips, and welcome to part two of our Medieval Europe lecture series. In this lesson, we'll be going over feudalism and the rise of towns. In this lesson, we'll be talking about the feudal order, basically how society ranked themselves back in medieval Europe. We'll also be talking about the medieval manners, basically where these folks lived and how they operated along pretty much these plantations or farms is a good way to look at it. And we'll start to see the emergence of these villages, or so-called villages, into trading hubs or into big cities. Uh, Things to keep in mind is how does chivalry affect knights? Knights had to follow a code of chivalry. We get our modern day concept of manners from this. And we'll also be taking a look at how these cities start to develop. So, with that being said, let's get into it. All right, get my ugly mug out of the way. So the feudal order. During the Charles the Hammer Martels, if you don't remember him, he was the Frankish king who would drive out the Muslim Turks from the Iberian Peninsula, modern day Spain. He would give lands to nobles to support him because, once again, he's just a single man. He cannot physically patrol most of Europe. So he'd give it to his buddies, i.e., the nobles. In return, these nobles would take this land and cultivate it, make it profitable. Make sure the peasants are farming, start trading with other villages and stuff, so they can start taxing it, so on and so forth. After Martel's grandson, Charlemagne, also known as Charles the Great, also known as Father of Europe, the greatest Frankish king, because he was the first person to unite most of Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. But after Charlemagne died, there wasn't a good leader, a good king or queen to take over. So what you'll start seeing is all these nobles, they'll kind of not be petty, but they'll start feuding over who should be in control. One noble might take another noble's land with his knights and his armies, or defend it, so on and so forth. But after these kings have came and gone, you start seeing these nobles start feuding quite a bit. Moving on. But the feudal order, once again, at the very top of society, you have the kings and queens. Often you throw the church up there as well, because a lot of folks respected the church, in this case, the Catholic Church, to be more specific. And the next lesson that we'll be talking about when we go to start talking about the Reformation, we'll start talking about the differences between the Catholics and Protestants, but that's for another time. But anyways, beneath the kings and queens, you'd have royalty or the nobles. Uh, uh, the kings and queens would give the land to the nobles, and once again, they would cultivate this land and make it profitable and start sending surplus to the kings or queens. But they would give it to the lords, and they would pretty much watch over the land. Now, there's two types of lords, or two types of nobles. You got the lords and ladies, they're real fancy folks. Then you got the vassals. You can think of them as low-ranking nobles. I like to say they're kind of like they're the outcast of the nobility, like the weirdos, if you want to say the weird uncle at the Thanksgiving that nobody really likes. Think of vassals like that. They're still nobles, but it's hard to explain. They're still nobles, but they don't have as much clout as the lords and ladies. Uh, in return, these nobles they would shelter knights. They would provide knights a home. In return, these knights would protect their land or go seize more land. Meanwhile, training the peasants, they would train the peasants for the armies. And in return, the peasants they would be able to live on the land, but in return they had to farm the land, give a good portion of the crops that they grew to the nobles. The nobles will send those to the kings and queens. Uh, let's talk about the knights real quick. So the knights, uh, they would follow a code of chivalry, basically respecting women, obey the lords, honor the church, your country, all that so forth. Like yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am. Uh, Often romanticized in today's pop culture, especially in movies. So you see like the knights being all cannot make a mistake, all that good stuff. But this is where it comes from, the code of chivalry. These knights, they're not always at war 24/7, but like any warrior, like any fighter, they need to train. And so they'd often go to these tournaments. Most likely, you'll see people jousting. As you can see here, I think it's what Porky. No, it's not Porky Pig. Elmer Fudd. Anyways, but they would go to these tournaments. Now, these tournaments, you can think of them like modern day sporting events. A lot of folks look forward to this. They would support their local knights, like our knight's better than your knight, so on and so forth. Sometimes at these tournaments, these knights could win castles. That's very rare. Very rare. They could also win brides sometimes. Sometimes or money prizes. They didn't have cash back then, but like maybe some gold coins or so. But for the most part, it's just bragging your rights, just saying you're better than everybody. Like your training, your methods is better than everybody else. But they would go to these tournaments just to hone their skills, see what works and see what doesn't. Kind of like how MMA fighters or boxers or something, they would go and spar and train. Same thing with these tournaments. These knights would go to these tournaments and start jousting. They would be training. It wasn't always on horseback like you see in this up here. It's not always that. Sometimes it'll be on foot with shields and maces or swords or whatever. And they didn't try to kill each other. I mean, yes, death did occur, just like about any sporting events. Death would occur, but it was very rare. Uh, but yeah, the knights, they would just use this to help train themselves. But the big thing is they followed a code of chivalry. This is where we get our modern ideas about manners. Yeah, moving on. Let's talk about these peasants. So, at the bottom of medieval society, and pretty much every society, you had the peasants. Well, in medieval Europe, you had two types of peasants. You had the freemen and you had the serfs. Freemen, they paid basically paid rent. It's like they paid the rent to the nobles to be on the land. They would farm it, be able to keep some, like subsistent farmers. Remember the difference between subsistence farming and commercial farming is subsistent farmers just grow food for enough for them and their family, maybe for their neighbors, but they're not trying to make profit off of it. Meanwhile, commercial farming, you're growing crops to make a profit. These freemen, they would just do it for subsistence farming, and what excess they had, they would send to the lords and ladies. But the main group, what everybody was most likely been if they used a peasant back then, was a serf. Serfs, they kind of had it rough. They had no legal right. They was viewed at, they was more like property than people. I mean, if a lord didn't like what a peasant's doing, they could just flat out beat them up, even kill them if they didn't like it without repercussion. So once again, these serfs were looked at more like property than humans. But these serfs, they need permission to do just about anything, to leave the property, to marry, to go to church, you name it. The peasants needed permission from the whoever the landowner is at the time. But I mean, well, let's talk about these medieval manners. So, obviously, up here you'd have the nobility, probably more than likely lords and ladies living here. Also, you have the knight housed in this castle somewhere. Also, in this castle, you'd find like little schoolrooms, a dungeon, kitchens, things of that sort. In the book, it gives a dissected diagram of this. Make sure you check it out. By the way, I do have the ebook online for my students. Make sure you go to Google Classroom and check that out. Get ready for that quiz that we have coming next week. But I digress. You have the uh, lords and ladies and the knights living up here, and you would have the peasants. Obviously, they'd be living down here in these little huts. Sometimes the serfs, if they didn't have family or anything, they just live in like single room houses, just made of thatch. Uh, be very hard to live in winter. Very cold, hard to stay warm. Uh, But what little free time they did have, they would spend at the church. Church was almost compulsory or mandatory back in the day. So every Sunday they would go to church and attend mass. Remember, most of these folks are Catholics, so they're going to attend something called mass. A lot of you folks might recognize that as going to church on Sundays. Well, these guys would go to mass on Sundays. But this took off real well with the peasant class because they're working all day, out in the blistering sun, farming, just a mundane life. But all of a sudden, they're going to church on Sunday and they're hearing these priests and these monks. They're preaching about heaven. One day, just stick with it. Stick through the trials and tribulations. One day you'll be walking the streets of gold. You'll have your own mansion. Might look similar to this, but this gave peasants a lot of hope. And with that hope, Christianity will start catching on, especially with the lower classes. Just gave them something to live for. It gave them an escape from their humdrum life that they was going through. But like I mentioned earlier, they spend all their time farming. I don't know about you, but people don't like to work that hard. I don't. If I can find an easy way out of doing work, I'm going to do it. Same thing with these peasants. So what you'll start seeing is farming improvements because they're tired of working all the time. So some some inventions or some technological advances that you have in agriculture will be a wheeled plow. I mean, put iron plows there, but you have a wheeled plow. It helps you turn over the soil faster. Horse collars, have a horse be able to pull the plow for you, makes it a lot easier. Water mills help generate energy, so you can start grinding up your wheat and grains and stuff like that. And windmills, basically the same thing. But the big one is crop rotation. In class, we talked about how you have to give the land a break. The land's almost like the human body. The human body cannot work nonstop 24/7. Needs a break. Same thing with the land. So what you'll see here is maybe the first year they'll grow crops on this field and leave this field alone. Then the next year they'll leave this field empty and start growing on this. That way it gives the land time to recuperate, regenerate its nutrients, so on and so forth. But with all these farming improvements, you'll start seeing people start having more free time to pursue their interests, their passions. You start seeing instead of everybody having to spend all day farming, just only a couple people can do the work that a lot of people used to have to do. But since everybody has more free time, everybody doesn't spend most of their time farming. You'll start seeing people developing their business. Anything from like even basket weaving, blacksmithing, baking, carpentry, goldsmithing, silversmithing, you name it. People have more time to do this. Eventually, they got so good they was start establishing their own businesses. So what you'll start seeing popping up overnight is little cities that look similar to this. At first, it started out. Find a good spot for my face here. First, it started out like this. Like they get really good, and they might sell their goods to these local folks in their village, or maybe to the village next to them. Eventually, they came up with ideas like, well, if we all just meet in a central location, it'd be easier to sell to everybody instead of selling to like maybe 40 to maybe 200, 500 folks here at the most. Everybody start taking their goods to a central location from various villages, and you start meeting up to places like this. So instead of selling it to a limited number of people, like 500 at the most, you'll be able to start selling it to thousands at a time. You'll start seeing businesses start popping up everywhere, especially around Italy, around Florence and Milan, the Papal States is what to refer to. Uh, I digress. But after the fall of Rome, the infrastructure, meaning like roads and like public goods, like their version of the police force, their version of hospitals, things of that sort, it started went on decline. But when you start seeing these cities start popping back up, you start seeing these roads getting improved again. With better roads, you can go further out trading, makes trading easier. Uh, Yeah. So basically, since people don't have to farm as much anymore, they have more time to do what they like. Be able to start setting up their own businesses, and they start setting up cities like this. They'll start all of a sudden cities start popping up. You'll see a change in medieval society from people living in places like this to places like this. Next, the growth of cities. Let's see if I find a good spot for me here. The growth of cities, they would start quickly turning into trading hubs, especially around Italy, the Florence and Milan area, Sicily, parts of France, England. Those start getting in on the good or getting in on this. Uh, but the government, but this will give rise to a new middle class. If I can go back to my previous slide, this will start giving rise to a new class, what we like to call a middle class. You start seeing merchants, farmers, and craftsmen. Uh, Basically, they're not as fancy or important as the knights, vassals, and nobility, all those folks, but they're not peasants. Uh, Basically, these folk, the difference between the peasants and the middle class is these folks can make their own money. Like they're starting to make money while these folks barely made a dime, if they did at all. But these folks are starting to make their own money. With that, they start making their own money, but they're not working on a nobility's land anymore. So what they came up with is, well, we need to start taxing these cities, these businesses. That way, we could keep our roads up. We can start implementing high school, or not high school. We start implementing schools. You can start building churches, things of that sort. So they start collecting taxes in the cities. But the notable difference about these taxes are not going to the nobles or lords. They're just going to the city themselves. Very unique at the time. First time you've seen this is the higher class, the nobility is not getting these taxes. It's kind of just going to a centralized location to help improve the city. Uh, but yeah, you start seeing guilds pop up. Best way to think of as guild is to protect businesses because you'll start seeing like fraudulent business. Cause think of it like people trying to sell Chinese goods, trying to make a quick dollar. So these guilds, they kind of get established and think of it as being certified. These guilds will certify certain businesses so you know their goods are legit. Uh, Almost like copyright, trademark kind of stuff. But I digress. That's it for this little lesson. The next one is going to be obviously kind of gave you a sneak peek. I'll be talking about the kingdoms and crusades. We'll be talking about three kingdoms in particular. We'll start seeing England becoming what we recognize it as it is today. We'll see France, and we'll start to see the emergence of the Eastern Slavic states. Some of you guys might recognize that as Russia. But I digress. This has been History by Phillips. I've been Mr. Phillips, and stay tuned. Peace, and what wait for the next video to come out. If I remember how to turn this off. It's been a while. Peace. Take care. I'll see y'all in a moment.